it is?
Whatever time it is.
How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm up and vertical.
All right.
Always a good thing. So I'm assuming you have a series of questions.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
All right. So to start out with, just to give us a little bit of context, if you could tell me your name and a little bit about yourself, like where you grew up, how you got interested in libraries, things like that.
Okay, my name is Steve Wood, and I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, but left at age 1, so I really don't put much stock in that. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and then went to college. I went to college at Antioch down in Yellow Springs, Ohio. That was my first experience with Ohio. And I went 3 years there and got by the final year extraordinarily good at playing bridge and drinking beer, but hadn't done terribly well in school. So I left and ultimately joined the Air Force and got married about 6 or 8 months after I joined the Air Force. And we lived down in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is the home of the 101st Army Airborne Division. And we lived in town in an apartment. And there was a library in the town, not a particularly big one and not a particularly good one, but I have always been an avid reader, so I used the library. And it was because I think that I was obviously a serviceman that the librarian there followed me around as I went through the library looking to see what was on the shelves. And I would take a book out and return it to the shelf, and she would scurry up behind me and straighten up the shelf where I had taken out the book, whether it needed straightening or not. And I was absolutely appalled by that. And it was that experience that made me think, damn, I can do this better than that. And that's how I got interested in library school. After we got out of the service, we went back to my wife's home, which was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I got several jobs there, went back to school, got my Bachelor's of Science in Education, and then went on to Drexel University in Philadelphia while I was working at the public library in Lancaster. And over the years that I was there, I got involved with a project that established a statewide delivery service among any and all types of libraries. And I developed the program and supervised it. We had 3 trucks that all operated out of Lancaster. And then I redesigned it and distributed them to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and out of Harrisburg. And it was at that time I realized that my supervising this program was pretty stupid because I couldn't do it well. So I essentially resigned my position, worked myself out of a job. And then by then we had 3 kids. So I started looking for work and found an ad for adult services head at Cleveland Heights, and came in for the interview and got the job, and the rest, I guess, is history. So there you've got more than you ever wanted.
That's a good start. So what year was that you came to Heights?
It was my first day of working was the 17th of October in 1977.
Okay.
I remember it quite well. Had a lot of fun.
So that kind of brings me to my next question, and the question I've written down is, when did your connection with Heights Libraries begin? So it was finding that particular job posting.
Right, and it really was a rather fortuitous thing. The interview that I had, I flew into town and rented a car and came out to the Heights. Are you a local girl?
No, I've been here about 5 years.
Okay, you know your way around. I drove in from the airport and got into the Heights early and started driving around just to see what I could see what the community was like. And every time I turned a corner, I got lost. And it just was really very strange. And when I got to the interview, it was with my predecessor, who was then the assistant director, and that's Rachel Nelson, and her predecessor, who was the director of the library, a woman by the name of Sarah Cody. And I, kind of as an icebreaker, made some comment to Sarah about coming into town early and driving around, and the kept getting lost on the streets. And she said very seriously that when the town fathers had created Cleveland Heights, they were very proud of the fact that none of the roads went anywhere. And that really kind of endeared me to Sarah. And she was a tough cookie, just a really tough director. But I knew I could learn a lot from her. Well, I came in October of 77, and I think it was August of 78 she retired. So I was really rather upset because my reason, I thought, for coming there was to work with Sarah. Now, I spent most of my time working with Rachel, and Rachel and I are, to this day, very, very good friends, and I learned a tremendous amount from her. So that's kind of how I got there, and I never looked back. I spent, I don't know, over 30 years working for the Heights Library, and had a ball the entire time.
All right. So what are some of your best memories of working here?
Well, I'm not sure there's any one thing that strikes me. I've always been a strong believer in the premise that if you are going to do a job, you do your very best to enjoy everything you can about it. And the follow-up to that is, so if you don't enjoy a job, get out of it. And I've counseled any number of people in that philosophy and have lost some staff members because of it. But I truly enjoyed, I think, everything that I did. There were moments that were tougher than others. The one that is easiest to remember is the renovation of the main library, because that was fraught with difficulties, both from city council and from the other architects that live in Cleveland Heights, of which at the time there was something like 90 active architects living in Cleveland Heights, which I said at the time and say to this day was more than any community deserved. They made life tough, but I think the point is they made the project better because of their interest and their concern for the very best project. The first architect that we had, I really liked, and we're still very good friends. But he listened almost exclusively to me. And the design that he came up with, which interpreted my interior needs and his exterior design desires, came up with a design that was ugly as hell, to be perfectly honest. I had known we were going to build the walkway across the street, and a lot of his design was done to meet the idea that I had for that walkway. Because I got the idea in my head that it would be just cool as hell to have the walkway expand as it was directly over the street till it was a good-sized room. And it was my idea how cool it would be to have programs out there, reading on the walkway or books on the trellis or something. I don't know. But I also got the idea that we could use different color squares of carpet tiles in there and have large-sized chess games. And I just thought that would be cool as hell. And I never really got beyond all of that with that particular architect. And things got so rough that the board, in its wisdom, and rightly so, discharged him. And we went out and got a new architect, which turned out to be Studio Technique, which is now over in University Circle. And they did the job that you see today. And I think they did a fine job, and it was a great addition to the community. And I think the community feels that way as well. City Council certainly did. And so that was a kind of a lesson to me. You learn from everything you do, and if you don't learn, then you're not keeping your eyes open. I did some teaching for Kent State and was an adjunct professor there, and I always told my classes that my goal in the class was to learn from them, because none of us know so much that we can't learn from the experience. So, well, that's a couple of things. The main library was a wonderful experience. The teaching at Kent was wonderful. I suspect you're aware that Cleveland Heights was the first library to join with the Cleveland Public Library in what is now known as cleavenet. Mm-hmm. And I had a great time with that. Rachel Nelson, who was director at the time, really was not very technologically savvy. And I wasn't either, because there wasn't a single computer in the building at that time. But I was a lot more open, and Rachel got the idea, got the concept, and told me to move on it and to make it happen. And we did, and it's grown to, I don't know how many libraries are in it now, but it's probably the largest entity in the state as far as a cooperative system is concerned. So those were good times. That'll do. But all were good. I mean, that's the point.
So what was the experience like of helping to create cleavenet, what ultimately became cleavenet?
Well, as I say, there were no computers in the building. The idea of replacing the card catalog, if you even remember what a card catalog was, replacing the card catalog was totally new. Cleveland was way ahead of its time, although it was not the only library in the country that was automating. It was fairly far down the line, but their idea of extending the value of their automated system to other libraries in the area was relatively new. That was really exciting, and I bought into that and really wanted to see it happen. I remember after it was up and running, it was just so slow, it was almost impossible. And thank God for staff, because they spent a lot of their time making excuses to the public because of how badly the system was functioning at the time. I can remember when we first started registering customers, we set up a separate desk, and I would work there along with everybody else. And you got to the point where you would type in a person's name and you would press enter, and you would sit there and wait for it to digest that piece of information before it went on to another. And I got very good at shooting the bull, I guess is the way to say it, because you didn't want to just sit there in a vacuum and twiddle your thumbs. You had to keep up some sort of a patter with the customers, or they walk out in disgust. But then later on, after we got the circulation portion of it functioning, we were ready to bring online the online catalog, which was a part of it. And it was getting rid of the card catalogs was a rather traumatic thing for a couple of reasons. We got rid of the author title catalogs first, and we separated it out, so subjects were separate. We kept the subject file long after we got rid of the others. But the card catalog was located in, I'm going to have to think a little bit about where it was. It was located in the center of the adult area, which at that time was in the children's room. Okay. And located in a spot that would have been right outside the children's program room there, was a circular staircase that went to the second floor. And it had been installed in 1966, I think. No, that was installed right before I came. It was done in like 76. There'd been a flood in the main library, and they had to replace all the carpeting. And they put in this circular staircase because the fiction collection was on the second floor. And they wanted an easy way for everybody to get from the first floor to the second floor. Well, they decided first off that about the second day, I guess, that it was up and open, that it was unsafe as hell because people going up and down that thing it just was very unsafe. Plus, because it was an open staircase, the stair treads around the outside were very dangerous. If a kid came along and ran into one of those steps, it would have taken his head over. So they closed it off from the public. And shortly after I got there, I moved all the card catalogs so they encircled that circular staircase to keep the public away from it. And we kept it open for staff to go up and down. But eventually we stopped even that because it just was more trouble than it was worth and just wasn't safe. So after we got rid of the author title catalog, I had fewer things to put around the circular staircase. That was a real problem. I had to scrounge around for map cases and other pieces of the furniture, anything I could find to help block that staircase off. So we were very slow in getting rid of the subject card catalog. It was partly because of the need for something to go around the staircase, but also because we just were kind of afraid to be without that backup. Well, it turned out we didn't really need it, and we got rid of it, and ultimately we took the staircase down, so we didn't need the furniture around it, and everything worked out. But those early days were, it's really hard to imagine now. You've gone through so many iterations of the online catalog, and it's gotten so much better that it's hard to imagine what those early days were like. And it was in some ways kind of barbaric, but still it was new and fun, and I think worked out.
Yeah. All right. So that kind of goes along with one of my other questions, which is how has technology in particular changed in the library over your time here?
Oh, my God. Like I said, there was no automation in the library at all. I brought the first PC into the library, and it was a Macintosh, one of the very first ones. And no one else was interested in it, so I used it myself. I wasn't going to let them use it anyway. Frankly, I had too much fun with it. But that was the very beginning. And the next ones that came in were made by a company called DEC, who made the hardware for the online catalog. And we brought those in, and they were difficult to use, and we only had maybe two in the building because they were so expensive. Personal computers back then were a lot bigger than they are now. I'm looking at you on a real lightweight laptop.
Yeah.
And we didn't have anything like that. It was just these big boxes. And if you've ever been anywhere near a Macintosh, you know it's relatively small. This one that we had from DEC was much larger. I don't know, probably 2.5 to 3 feet long and about 2 feet deep. The processor was, and then the monitor sat on top of it, and the keyboard was separate. So it was, those early days were really kind of strange, and you couldn't do a whole lot. Word processing was about the only thing that you could do. I think we could use those early computers to search the catalog, but they would have had to have been hardwired. We did not have wireless back then. just kind of snowballed. We got more and more computers, and until today, virtually everybody in the building's got one that they have easy access to. But it wasn't that way in the beginning. With the staff, wasn't as big as you have now, but with a staff of 100 and 125, to have just one or two computers is really kind of strange. And we didn't have all that many located around the library. There were like two out on the floor that were directly connected with the online catalog. That's all they did. And then we had two or three for the staff to use at the information desk. And I understand you're going back to an information desk. I was the one that eliminated them. That was never very popular with the staff, but seemed like a good idea at the time. But then it just kind of grew from those one or two computers to what we have today. And we didn't have email back then. Nobody else had a computer. There was no point in having email. But that came along in time somewhere along the way. I'm not really sure where. Those early days were really rather pioneering. It was compared to what you have today, pretty barbaric.
All right. So kind of going along with that, how have the services that the library provides changed over time?
I think the services, by and large, are still pretty much the same. What has changed is the way the services are provided. When I first got there and took over adult services, we worked out of a central desk. They were low desks, regular desk height, and the staff member would sit behind the desk, and the customer or patron, as I called them back then, till I learned the error of my ways. The patron would stand on the other side and look down at the top of our heads. So if you were going bald, it was not a nice place to be. But what it also did was it even though the customer was higher than the staff member, it put the staff member in a position of authority, a position of power. And I really hated that. And when I started, the first thing I did was to show the staff that was working for me, because I was running adult services then, how I thought good customer service could be provided. And I always stood up. I never sat down at the desk. Even writing I would do leaning over the desk, so that it kept me on an eye level with the customer. And eventually we got rid of the desks, and I put in counters and stools, and there were constant complaints about that because, something new, something different. But we staged these things in. We put in a counter as part of the desk first, then got rid of the other low desks and replaced it with more counter. And I think changed a lot of people's attitudes for that. When we built the main library, I tried to distribute the staff around the adult services area, so they would be closer to the public when the public wanted assistance. And the idea was that the phones staff carried was the way for them to keep in communication with each other. And it never quite worked the way I had pictured it. It does in some other libraries. They may be larger than ours. But there was always a resistance to that. There was always a resistance to being isolated from their staff. And in fact, that was part of what I was thinking about. What happens all too often is if you get 3 or 4 staff members based together, they tend to start talking amongst themselves, and they forget what's going on around them. They not because they want to, but just because they don't see them, they tend to ignore the public, and that's really bad customer service. I was president of the Ohio Library Association back in, I think, 1990, and the preceding year, as vice president, I chaired the annual conference, and we had it down in Dayton. And my theme for that year was, let's hear it for the customer, because I wanted to get that focus back on customer service that I believed was where we ought to be, and that I did not think many libraries professed. So that was the theme that I had for that year, and frankly, that's always been my focus in library service, is that it's focused on the customer. It has everything to do with meeting the customer's needs as quickly and as satisfactorily as possible. And what was your original question? How have things changed? I think that's, to my mind, the biggest change that we made. And I'd like to think that everything that we've done has had that in mind. I mean, the self-service checkout really was focused on customer service. I wanted them to be able to do it so that they didn't have to stand in long lines. The waiting in line just has always driven me up the wall. I don't like to do it, and I don't do it well. So that was the idea behind the self-charge machines. And but yet at the same time, I realized that the only way we were going to get the customers to use this new technology was to have someone out there to help them, to answer their questions. And we did that from the very beginning. We're one of the only libraries. We certainly weren't the only ones that were using self-charge machines. We were the first that I know of in Ohio to go to all self-charge. And even when other libraries were doing that, they never stationed anybody out to help the public. We always did that.
All right. What else do I have? So as we are starting the process of going through renovations on UH, how have the buildings changed during your time here? Obviously, remodeling Maine was a major part of that.
Well, yes, but it's true of all 3 branches. As I think back on, the thing that I remember first of all is that they're all brighter than they used to be, and they're all carpeted, which they weren't. Main Library was carpeted first, and that was done, the original carpeting in 77. God, that was ugly carpeting. That was a gold color, gold with a hint of brown mixed in so that it wasn't a solid color, but it was just one of the most bilious colors I think I have ever seen. But all 3 of the branches have been remodeled in my time, and then again, Noble was finished after me. I haven't seen Coventry. and what's been redone there. And I know that that has expanded. Coventry is a whole different kettle of fish, and kind of an interesting one in a way. But and then University Heights was redone, 8, 9, 10 years ago, maybe. I kind of forgotten the date. But having carpeting makes a world of difference, not just in sound, but in the perception that people have of a space. It's far greater with carpeting than it is with tile. And the tile at Noble was a dark brown. Oh God, it was an awful color. And the tile at Coventry, I believe, was black, and it was even worse. And the windows are somewhat darkened, Coventry, so there wasn't that much light coming in. And off of that black floor, it was just terrible. University Heights has always been the brightest because of those front windows, and I'm very glad that they're keeping that, because I always thought that was one of the best points of a rather unattractive building. Better soon.
So how did those changes to the buildings impact the cities, just the community in general?
Well, it certainly at the time increased circulation. I think we saw considerably more foot traffic coming into the building, especially after the Noble remodeling, because it had been inaccessible to the handicapped before that renovation, and that making it handicapped accessible, I think, brought in a lot of people that might not have come otherwise. Same thing happened with Coventry, because it had not been accessible until we opened up the lower door. It's not a great entrance for the disabled, but in the context of that particular building, is about the best you can do. Its location. I've always said that public buildings that were built back in the early days, and Coventry was, I think, built in like 26, 1926. Mm-hmm. There obviously was no one who was handicapped that were out and about in those days, because there were no public buildings that were designed to handle someone in a wheelchair, someone on crutches, someone, I'm not even sure they had walkers back then. But, I guess what we did was we locked our disabled away in the attic and forgot about them, because we sure didn't design for them. And that building is a perfect example of that. The only way to come in was by installing an elevator, which we had to do, and in opening up that outside door. And back in its first days, Coventry was the main library for the system, and the Lee Road building was just a branch. And back in the early days, Coventry had all 3 floors that were dedicated to the library, back space as well as front space. And we eventually tried to sell that building, and got so much flack from the community that we didn't do it. And then ended up doing major remodeling with it, because we knew we were going to be stuck with it, whether we needed that 4th building or not. More than what you asked for.
Oh, that's good. So we've talked a lot about how the library itself has changed. Since you were here for a long period of time, how has the community, how have University Heights and Cleveland Heights changed over that same period?
I'm not. That's really a very good question. The thing that attracted me to the Heights, once I realized it was this way, was its liberalism and its level of education, its concern for social issues. I absolutely love the Heights. And I retired in August of 2008, and in the fall of 2007, we moved out of Cleveland Heights to Lyndhurst, so that I would be close to a daughter of mine who just purchased a construction company, and she needed us to babysit. And so we moved over to be near her. Well, the economy turned, and she lost the construction company and went into bankruptcy. And she'd been divorced, but then connected with an old high school, Heights High School flame, and they got married and moved to Philadelphia. So there I was, stuck in Lyndhurst, which just between you and me is about as exciting to live in as to watch milk curdle like it. I was never happy in Lyndhurst because I was constantly comparing it to the Heights, where there was always something happening. There was always a cause to rally behind. There was always something interesting going on. And, the schools have had their difficulties, but the community has always been behind the schools, despite the difficulties that it had. It has old bitches and grouses about increased taxing and difficulties with grades. But all in all, the community is very supportive. Something happened.
I think the video might have frozen for a little bit. It seems to be okay now.
Well, I've got an extra panel open on the side, and I don't know what to do with that. Well, who cares? If you don't care, I don't care. Anyway, our first levy was in 2004, and it was a 5-year levy. So we were ready for a new one in 79, and I'd been there a couple of years. And then I'm not sure if there were 2 more 5-year levies after that, or if that's when we went into a continuous levy. But the library has never lost a levy. And one of the things that I still watch with great interest is how levies are doing around the state of Ohio, because the income from the state has been decreasing rapidly over the last few years, and more libraries are having to go to property tax levies in order to support what they've been doing. It's not a matter of building their collections and their libraries and their services. It's a matter of maintaining them, that they have to go for levies. And I've always been proud of the fact that our library, as other libraries in Cuyahoga County, I might add, have always passed the levies. And this kind of tremendous support, I think, is rare. As I've traveled around the country and talked with other libraries, they're always envious of our financial situation. But what they don't see is the financial support that we get directly from our communities, and how continuous that is, and how good it is. It really is unusual. Cuyahoga County is probably isn't unique, because I don't like that word, but it's one of a handful of counties in the United States that totally supports libraries in the way ours do. I can't think of any library that in Cuyahoga County that's failed an operating. It just doesn't happen. But that's the kind of thing that I find exciting. It's the libraries on the west side tend to be more conservative than the libraries on the east side. I would never have been happy in Westlake or in Lakewood, just because they're more conservative than we are on the east side. And it's just been great fun listening to customers and listening to what their demands were, what their needs were, and in doing our part to respond to those needs. I love that. I absolutely, as happy as I am now in where we are in Philadelphia, it can't hold a candle to Cleveland Heights. It really can't.
All right. So have any of the demographics of the communities changed or shifted over time?
Well, obviously the population has decreased in both Cleveland Heights and University Heights. I'm not sure I fully understand why that is, because there seem to be more apartments available now than there were back in the day, but yet population is still decreasing. I don't understand that. One of the reasons that I hear is because Cleveland Heights, as an entity, has taxed itself is taxing itself out of existence because people can't afford to live here. And I'm not sure that I buy that, although I think that's certainly true to some extent. I think the fact that Cleveland has been somewhat depressed has been a problem, because people have to move away in order to find jobs. Mm-hmm. And that may be the reason why there's a problem in the Heights as there are in other bedroom communities around Cleveland. If there isn't work in Cleveland, then there isn't work in the suburbs. That's just a fact. And but I see Cleveland starting to turn around. That may be more perception than or what I want to have happen than reality. But I think it's going to happen, which means that there will be an increase in population taking place in the nearby suburbs, I would suspect. Although one of the things that I see coming with Cleveland is people having more of a desire to live downtown. Mm-hmm. I think that's happening, and I at one time suggested to my wife, and made it pretty clear that living in town was not something that was going to happen. So we ended up staying in Cleveland Heights, but I think it would be great fun to live down in the warehouse district or down in the flats. I think that would have been just cool as hell.
All right. So I think that's most of my questions.
All right.
But do you have any stories that you would want to share?
Oh, I don't know if you can hear it, but
yeah.
our fire alarm has just gone off.
Oh, good.
No, this happens fairly regularly.
Oh, no.
We're in a senior living community. God, that thing is so loud. I hope you can still hear me as I talk. But, all it takes is somebody popping the wrong door open, and I think this thing goes off. And there are sections of assisted living people here in this complex, and it may well have been them that set this damn thing off. My wife is probably getting ready to bury herself in the back bathroom just to get away from it. Just awful.
Oh.
Oh, well, you take the bitter bit, the better, I guess.
Yeah.
I wish you luck in your oral histories and so forth. I was kind of interested, and now the phone's going. Of course, why not? I was kind of interested that you're going for a 100-year anniversary now, and because I think it was 1921 that the first library opened up in Cleveland Heights. What happened would have happened in 1960 was that they formed a committee to talk about may see a meltdown here. So I was kind of surprised that she picked now for a 100-year anniversary. Although I don't blame her. I wouldn't have wanted to wait till 2021 either. I would have been much happier going in 2016. So I have to myself avoided the 21 date. Stick with Nancy's 2016. And when she has the actual date, the program set, I think I'd ask her to let me know. And I would pass that on to her through you because I want to come into town for it.
Definitely.
Okay.
All right. So thank you very much for your time. And of course, now it stops going off. Maybe not. No. Never mind.
It's just deafening. I don't know where my wife is. She just ignored the phone. So, anyway, you have a good day.
Yep, you too.
And maybe we'll talk again.
All right. Thank you very much.
Take care, Ann.
Bye.
Bye-bye.